In 1966, a 14-year-old girl in Houston rode her bike away from home on a blistering afternoon and vanished without a trace, leaving her family and the entire neighborhood torn apart by unanswered dread. Police suspected a man who lived near the scene and who also left the area right after the day she disappeared, but with no body, no witnesses, and countless vague leads, the investigation quickly stalled. Yet for more than half a century, one young investigator refused to give up, clinging to forgotten details and believing the truth was still buried somewhere in those old case files. Then one day, while re-examining evidence everyone else had dismissed as meaningless, she spotted a single detail that every previous investigator had overlooked. A detail powerful enough to flip the entire case upside down and shock everyone involved in ways no one saw coming. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you're into cold cases being reopened. The Houston summer of 1966 stretched on under suffocating heat that seemed to melt everything, the pavement shimmering under blinding white sunlight, cicadas droning from the tree canopies, the smell of freshly cut dry grass rising in waves, and the neighborhood kids still tossing a plastic ball back and forth like the stifling air didn't bother them at all. Amid all the familiar sounds of a southern U.S. afternoon, Janet Harland, a petite 14-year-old with her hair tied up neatly in a high ponytail, wheeled her green bicycle out of the yard. In her hand was a book wrapped in brown paper, its corners already a little worn, ready to return to a friend. There was nothing special about that moment, just a girl leaving home, pedaling away from the familiar dirt path onto the narrow road ahead, where the slanting sunlight made everything shimmer in the heat. Janet put her foot on the pedal and glided off, rounding the corner lightly, her cotton dress fluttering in the breeze. A neighbor watering plants smiled at her. Janet turned and waved back with a bright smile, then kept pedaling farther away. No one paid much attention as her small figure faded into the glaring sun. No one thought that would be the last time they'd ever see Janet. Something about that afternoon, though so subtle it's hard to describe, made a few people in the neighborhood suddenly pause. The sound of her wheels seemed faster than usual. A hot gust of wind suddenly whipped through, then a thin fleeting silence between the familiar noises, as if Houston itself had held its breath before something was about to happen. But no one called it a premonition. It was just a passing oddity on an otherwise ordinary day. Janet didn't make it home for dinner. When the sun had shifted and the temperature dropped a little, her mother glanced at the clock, stepped out onto the porch, hoping to see Janet turn onto the familiar street. But the road only answered with the faded golden light of late afternoon. The family started walking the nearby blocks, asking neighbors, checking backyards. Everyone said they'd only seen Janet when she first left. Dusk fell, night deepened, street lights flickered on, but Janet still hadn't appeared. The evening air now felt heavier than the daytime heat, thick with unspoken anxiety. The Harlands' front door stayed cracked open, yellow light spilling down the steps and onto the pavement where her father stood staring down the dark street, hoping his daughter's silhouette on her bike would appear any second. But there was nothing but crickets and the fading sound of distant car engines. When full night came, and Janet still hadn't returned, the family called the police. That same evening, when the Harlands' call came into the dispatcher, a Houston Police Department patrol unit was sent to the neighborhood immediately. Police cars cruised slowly down the road that had baked all day under the sun, now only radiating lingering heat from the asphalt. Pale yellow streetlights cast shadows over the low trees, creating an eerie quiet, an oppressive silence made heavier by the fact that a 14-year-old girl hadn't come home. The first two officers on scene checked the routes Janet usually took whenever she went out. They swept flashlights along the dirt path her bike tires normally rolled over. The ground was undisturbed. No skid marks, no slide trails, no signs of impact or struggle. Along the row of houses to the east, where the neighbor watering plants had last seen Janet, the ground was perfectly clean too. No handkerchief, no scrap of paper, no small belonging left behind. Everything was neat and untouched, as if no one had passed through that afternoon. But that very neatness unsettled the police. Someone disappearing without leaving a single item behind was rare, especially for a teenager. They continued searching every plausible route Janet might have taken to her friend's house. The main road out of the block, the narrow alley behind the row of houses, and the turn toward the small park by White Oak Bayou. All three routes showed nothing unusual. On the main road, the streetlights were bright enough to see the flat, unmarked ground, no signs of bike tires skidding or hitting anything. In the alley, flashlight beams swept along the old wooden fences, revealing only fallen leaves and bits of gravel. No drag marks, no strange footprints, nothing dropped. At the park entrance, the dry dirt would easily show tracks, yet there was nothing. A literally empty route, and that made the officers feel like they were chasing something completely invisible. After nearly an hour of searching and finding nothing, one officer offered the first theory: Janet may have vanished in the short stretch between two rows of houses where no one's line of sight reached, a blind spot in the neighborhood, less than 30 meters long, but secluded enough to hide anything that happened in a few seconds. It was the spot where two roads crossed, but was shielded by low trees and an empty house that had been for sale for months. At night, that stretch was darker than the rest of the block. If a car stopped there for just a few seconds, very few people would notice. But it remained only a theory, with no physical evidence to back it up. As police kept searching, the first neighbor statements started coming in, but they were all so vague, they couldn't be pieced into any investigative direction. An elderly woman near the corner said she heard a sound like wheels going fast that afternoon, but wasn't sure if it was a bike or a truck. A boy playing ball at the park thought he maybe saw Janet turn down the back alley, but couldn't remember the exact time. A young couple said they didn't notice anything strange, but remembered a dog barking persistently near the empty house. No one knew if that meant anything. Every statement was full of hesitation: I think, maybe, I'm not sure. No one said anything definitively. Police recorded every word, but couldn't form a coherent picture because every piece was missing its edges. What worried them more was the neighborhood's unusual quiet. In a missing child case, they expected at least some sign of disturbance: a dropped item, an odd tire mark, a confirmed scream, a witness certain of what they saw. But there was only emptiness, an emptiness so perfect it felt abnormal. By midnight, after finishing the outer perimeter search, police returned to ask the Harland family about Janet's routine and habits. But the information was as ordinary as any other day. Janet had no reason to be gone this long, and no habit of going far alone. That only made them more certain something had happened to her, and it happened in an extremely short window of time, in an extremely hard-to-spot location. But who did what, and how? It was all still murky. The initial search ended in the heavy silence of a neighborhood that seemed to wake up to an unthinkable disappearance, yet left no trail to follow. The next morning, as fresh sunlight hit the low rooftops of Houston Heights, the neighborhood was still shrouded in unease from the night before. Police returned to the routes Janet usually took, this time with clearer daylight and hope that the sun would reveal something darkness had hidden. And then a young officer named Whitaker crouched near the old wooden fence of house number 214 and spotted a small object caught between two slats, a pale purple ribbon fragment, frayed at the edges and dusted with dirt. It wasn't definitive proof it belonged to Janet, but the color matched the ribbon she often used to tie her hair. An item so tiny it could belong to anyone, yet in a context where nothing else existed, it instantly became the first lead. Whitaker carefully lifted it with tweezers and sealed it in an evidence bag. What caught his attention more than the ribbon itself was its strange position, not lying on the ground, not tangled in bushes, but wedged between two boards, as if someone or something had accidentally torn it off while passing very close to the fence. It didn't say much, but at least it suggested Janet might have come near this spot, or been taken past it. As officers kept searching around the fence, a new witness came forward. A middle-aged man who lived alone across the street said that the previous afternoon he saw Janet riding east, turning off her usual route onto the road leading to the alley behind the houses. He was certain, saying he recognized the green bike and Janet's high ponytail as she sped past his yard. This statement immediately opened a new investigative path. If Janet suddenly changed direction, why? Did she have plans with a friend who lived that way? Or was something making her avoid the usual route? But just minutes later, another witness told a completely contradictory story. Mrs. Harrington, who lived in the yellow house at the top of the street, insisted she had been in her yard all afternoon, and Janet never passed by. She said, "If that girl had gone right in front of my house, I would have seen her. No way I'd miss it." While the first witness swore Janet turned east, Mrs. Harrington said the east side saw no sign of her. Both lived right near where Janet might have passed, both spoke with absolute certainty, yet they said opposite things. As police took down the statements, every word carried caution. Such contradictions aren't rare in missing persons cases, but at this stage, with no clear physical evidence, they made the case even more unpredictable. And instead of being dismissed, the contradiction exposed a scarier possibility. Janet may never have taken any of the routes people assumed she did, or she did, but was stopped before she could appear in either witness's line of sight. A veteran officer looked over both statements and said only, "If both are confident they're right, that means there's something we're not seeing." When police compared the two witnesses' vantage points, they realized the gap between their lines of sight included a short stretch of road behind the fence, exactly where the ribbon fragment was found. It was one of the neighborhood's blind spots, fleeting, shaded, rarely traveled, and narrow enough that anyone lingering there would go almost unnoticed. That suddenly made the ribbon far more significant. A seemingly meaningless clue had become the first sign that contact, impact, or some action had occurred in that area, completely outside the view of the neighbors police had relied on the night before. Also that morning, another resident came forward, saying they remembered hearing a sound like someone hurrying over gravel behind the houses, but heard no screams or arguing. Police noted it, yet still couldn't reconstruct Janet's final path because none of the pieces fit together. And as they tried to connect those statements, for the first time they clearly felt, this disappearance wasn't a typical runaway or lost child case. It was too clean, too silent, and every element felt deliberately concealed. Staring at the sealed little ribbon on the table, one officer said, "If this really is Janet's, then who or what ripped it off right in the most hidden spot in the whole neighborhood?" That was the first moment they understood this case would be anything but simple. By noon that same day, with the sun at its peak and harsh white light blanketing Houston Heights, the HPD team spread a map of the area across the hood of a patrol car. It was a 1966 Houston map, ink faded, neighborhood boundaries drawn in old pencil, but enough to reconstruct Janet's possible routes. Based on statements from the previous night and that morning's witnesses, police circled 3 paths Janet might have taken when she left to return the book to her friend: the main street running along the Harlan block, the narrow road behind the houses leading to a dead-end alley, and a third rarely used shortcut connecting to vacant land near White Oak Bayou. At the time Janet disappeared, all 3 were familiar neighborhood roads, but when laid side by side, what stood out was a disturbing common factor. Every route had a short section almost completely invisible from any window or yard. On the map, those sections were only a few dozen meters long, but in a disappearance, a few dozen meters is the line between safety and vanishing. On the main road, the blind spot sat between 2 homes with high fences and thick foliage that blocked views from inside. The back route passed an abandoned lot where a house had burned years earlier and never been rebuilt. The shortcut to the vacant land was so narrow only one vehicle could pass, and the glaring sun made the area blinding, causing quick movements to be easily missed. Standing at each spot and looking the way Janet might have come, the officers felt the same unease in just a few seconds, with a car pulling up or someone stepping out from shade. Janet could be stopped without anyone in the neighborhood noticing. The terrifying part was that Janet could have disappeared right in the heart of a busy residential area, a place anyone would assume was safe because dozens of families were around every day. But the reality revealed gaps in visibility few people noticed. A young officer stood at the start of the main road's blind spot, imagining Janet riding past the previous afternoon. If someone was waiting, just a few quick steps forward or an arm reaching from behind the fence, and it would be over in seconds. Beside him, the more experienced officer nodded. These stretches are always where it happens. People think kids get taken in dark parking lots or empty parks, but the most dangerous places are right next to your own house, when no one expects it. When they rechecked the spot where the ribbon was found that morning, everything became clearer. The evidence lay exactly within the blind spot of the first route, where no witness had a direct view. It wasn't conclusive proof, but it was the first match between the map and physical evidence. From there, police started connecting what they had. Janet left via the Harlan Street direction, multiple vague witnesses, 2 contradictory statements, and a ribbon fragment appearing in a spot no one could see. Placed on the map, a new possibility emerged. Janet was intercepted without any scream, or any cry was muffled by kids playing ball, the hum of porch fans, or the stifling afternoon that made everything feel heavy and stagnant. One investigator suggested a field test. He stood where the neighbor had been watering plants the day before, while another officer stood a short distance away in the blind spot. When the second officer whispered, or even spoke loudly, the sound barely carried through the thick, soupy air between the houses. It was chilling proof. If Janet made any noise, chances are no one heard it. When police reviewed those routes one last time, the case felt entirely different. No longer a kid wandering off or leaving on her own. No longer coincidence that no one saw anything. It was a deliberate scenario. A person or a vehicle had exploited the exact blind spot in the neighborhood's layout, the exact moment no one was looking, on the exact sweltering afternoon, when everyone was trying to escape the scorching heat. That was the moment police first suspected this wasn't an accidental disappearance, but a tightly executed abduction, carried out in a very short time with calculated choice of location and sightlines. And when they circled those 3 blind spots on the map in red, the circles overlapped in the center, the place where every possibility converged, and where Janet may have vanished. That afternoon, as the police team continued sweeping the 3 routes and the blind spots marked on the map, a new statement made them stop in their tracks. A middle-aged man named Carl Denton, who lived in a wooden house just 2 blocks from the vacant lot, stepped out when he saw officers passing by. He hesitated for a moment before speaking, as if unsure whether what he'd heard was important enough to report. Then he said, late in the afternoon on the day Janet disappeared, he heard a short, very low cry, like someone startled or frightened, coming from the direction of the vacant lot, where the burned-down house from years ago still stood abandoned. He said it wasn't an argument, wasn't kids playing, but a sound that was swallowed halfway, as if someone had managed to cover the mouth before it fully came out. Denton had been gardening in his backyard at the time, and the neighbor's lawnmower made him unsure of what he'd heard. He'd meant to brush it off, thinking it might be a cat or kids, but when news broke about a missing girl, the memory suddenly became sharper. Police immediately headed to the vacant lot to check. At noon, the place looked like nothing more than a patch of dry, barren ground surrounded by low bushes and the remaining brick walls of the burned house. The surface was covered in coarse gravel, hard and brittle, difficult to hold tracks. Officers walked in a line, sweeping east to west. They looked for drag marks, footprints, scraps of fabric, dropped items, swirls in the dirt. Nothing, not a piece of a bicycle, not a stray hair, not a scuff mark. Everything was disturbingly calm, as if someone had erased every trace before sunset. They widened the search to the tree line, poked through bushes, shone flashlights into cracks in the charred walls, still nothing. In the 1960s, crime scene protocol wasn't as strict as it is today. No dedicated forensics team, no soil analysis tech, no tools for micro-trace scanning. Everything relied on the naked eye and experience, and sometimes the naked eye misses the smallest, most crucial things. One young officer figured the ground was too dry to hold prints, and the cry Denton heard was probably kids in the nearby park, echoing strangely. Another thought that if this really was where Janet met harm, there would have to be signs of a struggle, but since there weren't any, the odds were low. They recorded Denton's statement, lightly marked the area, and moved on. The vacant lot was removed from the list of priority locations. Procedurally, The decision seemed reasonable, no physical evidence, no signs of crime, a vague statement, but that surface-level reasonableness became the first misstep, when police didn't give enough weight to the one signal that would later prove to be the most critical moment of that afternoon. At the time, no one on the team looked back at the map and realized the vacant lot sat exactly at the intersection of the 3 blind spots identified the previous morning. No one connected the ribbon fragment found near the fence to the possibility that Janet had been intercepted and then taken toward this lot. No one considered that the abruptly cut-off cry might explain why no one heard anything more. The absence of ground traces was treated as proof nothing happened, instead of a sign that if something did happen, it was carried out extremely fast, extremely cleanly, and extremely discreetly. As the officers walked away from the vacant lot, none of them knew they had just left what would later be confirmed as the pivotal location, their own boot prints pressed into the gravel, diluting any future chance of analysis. One officer glanced back one last time and said the place was too ordinary to be a crime scene. But sometimes ordinary is the perfect disguise. In that day's internal report, the vacant lot was given only one line, no relevant signs discovered. That brief, seemingly harmless note became the boundary that pushed the search off its most critical path for weeks to come. Only years later, when the file was reopened, did people realize that the decision to temporarily dismiss the vacant lot had sent the investigation down a completely different and wrong track, the first strategic error that kept Janet Harlan's disappearance a mystery for more than half a century. In the days after Janet Harlan vanished, the Houston Heights neighborhood sank into a chaotic mix of anxiety and frantic willingness to help. Residents poured into the streets, forming small groups to scour vacant lots, narrow paths, areas around the park, even backyards they'd never normally enter. Their intentions were good, but that very eagerness caused consequences. No one foresaw the potential crime scenes were catastrophically disturbed. On the morning of the second day, when police returned to the vacant lot, where Carl Denton's statement had just been downplayed the day before, they found the ground now covered in fresh footprints. No one could tell which belonged to neighbors, which to the officers from the night before, and which, if any, might be connected to Janet. A gravel path leading behind the abandoned house had been trampled so thoroughly that no one could distinguish scratches that happened before or after Janet disappeared. Any chance of analyzing tracks became meaningless. On the narrow back road, one of the 3 key blind spots, soft dirt along the fence line, had been run over by kids and adults searching in groups. Overlapping footprints created a completely scrambled surface that couldn't be reconstructed. In just 24 hours, locations that might once have held evidence had turned into chaos with zero forensic value. A young officer sighed when he realized it, but at that point the team still didn't have enough justification to cordon off the area, and didn't yet understand that the contamination had permanently buried some crucial traces. It wasn't just the scene that got messed up, evidence handling had errors too. The purple ribbon fragment found near the fence, the first item possibly linked to Janet, should have been sealed in a clean bag with exact location, collector and time recorded. But 1966 procedures weren't that tight. It went into a paper bag that wasn't airtight and couldn't handle moisture. By the time it reached the station, some of the dirt on the ribbon had fallen off, making later analysis harder. Another item, a thin piece of metal, a resident picked up near the second turn, was deemed unrelated by police and left on a homeowner's step to be collected later. But night came, wind picked up, and the next morning it was gone forever. No one knew where it came from, or whether it actually mattered. Any small piece of evidence at that stage could have been a breakthrough, but inconsistent collection let many things slip into oblivion. Witness statements weren't recorded carefully either. Quick conversations on front lawns, under porches, the side grass, all written in different notebooks by different officers. Some notes were extremely brief, just a few hurried lines. Some statements were only remembered by the officer and never formally documented. A clear example, a woman near the intersection said she saw Janet riding past very fast, like she was being hurried by something. That should have triggered deeper questions. Hurried how? Where was she looking? Was anyone following? But because police were still focused on the vacant lot and other routes, They only wrote witness saw Janet riding fast, and moved on. Another resident mentioned seeing a strange car moving slowly near Janet's usual paths. When pressed for color, make, or plates, the person wasn't sure. Instead of being logged for cross-checking with other statements, it was labeled not credible and left out of the official report. These small oversights, repeated hour after hour, day after day, pushed the case further off the proper investigative track. To the police at the time, it was still just an unexplained missing person case, not enough signs to bring in major crime detectives. Because of that, basic steps like sealing the scene, systematic note-taking, preserving suspect areas, and proper evidence collection weren't done thoroughly. One officer later admitted they didn't think it was an abduction that first night, so they didn't treat the area like a potential crime scene. By the time red flags appeared, everything had already been overlapped and erased. In Janet's case file, years later people found short notes, no useful traces recovered from scene, evidence not clear enough, witness statements inconsistent. Those simple but heavy lines were the result of a chain of procedural mistakes in 1966, mistakes later seen as the main reason Janet Harlan's disappearance slid quickly from a search into an unsolvable mystery. Just as the scene contamination errors began piling up, the investigation slipped yet another step, this time, not from lack of evidence, but from suspicion pointed in the wrong direction from the start. On the afternoon of the second day after Janet vanished, a neighbor reported seeing a man hanging around the area several times the previous week. The man drove a dark-colored old pickup and often stopped to smoke at the corner near the Harlan house. No one knew who he was, and since a little girl's disappearance makes communities view strangers with alarm, police took the tip seriously. With so few leads, anything could become an anchor. Within hours they identified the man, a 42-year-old construction worker named Morgan Hale, who lived about 20 minutes from Houston Heights. Hale admitted he sometimes came to the area waiting for an acquaintance to return tools, but couldn't provide concrete proof of his exact whereabouts. The afternoon Janet disappeared, he said he didn't remember the timing because that day he was just running errands. Hale's vague alibi instantly made police treat him as a person of deeper interest, not because anything directly implicated him, but because he was the only one who couldn't give a solid answer. In child disappearances, a shaky alibi is always a red flag, and 1960s officers, less experienced with sophisticated abductions, easily poured all their attention into Hale. They spent nearly the entire next 48 hours chasing him, long interrogations, searching his home, interviewing his neighbors, examining the truck, digging into his schedule for the past 2 weeks. Everything came up empty. His truck didn't match any descriptions, showed no signs of cleanup, and still had construction site dirt from miles away. 2 acquaintances placed him at a building supply store around the time in question, not a perfect match, but enough to knock him off the top suspect list. The problem wasn't investigating Hale, it was investigating Hale too much. When police hyper-focused on one path, every other path got neglected. During those critical 48 hours, they didn't return to the vacant lot for fresh searches, didn't thoroughly check every backyard along the 3 routes, didn't expand to adjacent streets, didn't re-interview the contradictory witnesses. Those were 48 hours the team should have spent gathering more scene information. Instead they sat in an interview room repeatedly questioning a man who ultimately had nothing to do with it. By the time Hale was officially cleared, it was already the afternoon of the 4th day since Janet disappeared. The first shadow of truth, that the case had gone off course, began to appear. A young officer voiced concern, "We wasted way too much time on him. What if Janet was taken somewhere else while we were doing this?" No one had an answer. In missing persons investigations, every passing hour is a door closing. Traces on the ground can blow away, strange smells fade, evidence can be trampled, witnesses forget key details, and if there really was an abductor, he gained more time to leave the area. The intense focus on Hale didn't just cost them the golden hours, it also affected the team's mindset. When a suspect is ruled out, everyone has to go back to square one, back to the same old questions, vague statements, empty routes, back to the very silence that made the case baffling from the start. In a later internal report, a veteran officer wrote, "We chased the wrong guy just because he couldn't remember his exact schedule. The truth was still sitting somewhere in those blind spots nobody wanted to look at closely." That was when the team began to realize, too late, that Janet Harlan's disappearance wasn't just hard because of missing evidence. It was hard because from the very beginning they had been pulled away from the most important direction. And those 48 golden hours, once lost, could never be recovered. 2 months had passed since the afternoon Janet Harlan vanished, and Houston Heights had slowly returned to its normal rhythm, at least on the surface. Kids were still playing ball in the blazing sun, adults were still going to work, cicadas still droned from the treetops. But for the police, the Janet case seemed to sink into an unfillable void. No body, no belongings, no trace that she had left the neighborhood, and no sign that she was still in it. A disappearance so clean it was hard to believe. After 8 straight weeks of investigation, the case file grew thicker, but contained no additional meaningful information. Contradictory witness statements, routes with blind spots, a vacant lot with no traces, a ribbon fragment that couldn't be definitively tied to her, and a wrong suspect who had burned nearly 48 golden hours, all combined into a blurry picture where no one could tell what was real and what was just an echo of human memory. The officers originally assigned had to return to regular duties, while the main investigative team slowly ran out of avenues. For 2 months there were no new statements, no one found anything belonging to Janet, no calls reporting sightings in nearby areas. In the early days the media still ran stories, interviewed neighbors, asked whether this might be an interstate kidnapping, but when progress stalled, the press gradually pulled back. Many residents still thought of Janet whenever they passed the stretch where she disappeared, but time dragged them back to jobs, families, sweltering evenings on the porch, and life went on, even though the case still hung like a dark cloud that hadn't fully lifted. In internal police meetings, the tone had changed too, no longer the urgency of the first week, but the heaviness of a case with no way out. The lead investigator admitted in one report, "We have no physical anchor point, no starting point, no ending point. We're working in a vacuum." That technical remark perfectly captured what they were facing, a disappearance that left no directional traces at all. Even in the toughest cases of the era, police usually had at least one piece of evidence, one footprint, one small physical clue, but in Janet's case, everything seemed wiped clean from the very first minute. No bicycle, no shoes, no skid marks, no witness memory solid enough to reconstruct the path the girl had taken. One young investigator said during a meeting, "If nothing contradicts anything, then every possibility is true, and when every possibility is true, none of them are clear." Exactly 2 months after Janet vanished, the case was reviewed under Houston PD procedure. Missing juvenile cases were prioritized based on 3 factors: length of no contact, likelihood of voluntary departure, and the presence or absence of criminal indicators. Janet's case fell into a rare category: no signs of running away, yet no clear evidence a crime had occurred. That very gap made the decision difficult. In the end, because there was no trace proving Janet was still alive, but also no evidence to conclude she was dead, HPD classified the case as a serious missing person, a limbo status between active criminal investigation and archived file. That classification didn't mean the case was completely abandoned, but it did mean active investigative activities would be suspended. No more officers knocking on doors every day. No more maps spread across patrol car hoods each morning. No more wide area sweeps of the neighborhood. Janet Harlan's file was placed in a separate cabinet with other unexplained disappearances, waiting for a new lead, if a new lead ever appeared. The Harlan family kept putting up missing person flyers on light poles and store windows, but time faded them under the summer sun and August winds. Police, though they tried to stay in touch, had nothing new to tell them. In the final meeting before the investigation was officially suspended, the lead looked at the pages full of scribbled notes, the pale purple ribbon sealed in its bag, and the 3 red circled blind spots, the only things left from 2 months of effort. He said only one simple sentence, No one wanted to hear. If the girl was still around here, we would have found her by now. That was when the active investigation officially slipped into the shadows, and the Janet Harlan case entered years of silence, becoming one of Houston's most persistent mysteries of the 1960s. In 1971, 5 years after Janet Harlan disappeared without a trace, life in Houston Heights had changed a lot. New families had moved in, old houses had been renovated, and the kids who once played with Janet were now older, entering their teens, but the memory of that sweltering 1966 afternoon, when a girl rode her bike away from home and never came back, still lay deep in the neighborhood's collective memory, like a faint scratch time wasn't strong enough to erase. Then one day in early April, 1971, news of another missing girl brought it all back. This time the victim was 13-year-old Rebecca Sloan, who lived in the North Hill area, just 1.2 miles, as the crow flies from where Janet vanished. Rebecca disappeared on a Friday afternoon, while walking home from school after club activities. The temperature that day wasn't as brutal as July 1966, but the afternoon still carried Houston's signature dry, quiet heat, and just like Janet, Rebecca was on a familiar route, in a busy residential area, only a few blocks from home. The circumstances were nearly identical. Late afternoon sun, a stretch of road with no sightlines from houses, and an extremely short window, about 5 to 7 minutes, when no one remembered seeing the girl. No belongings left behind, no drag marks, no confirmed screams. One woman near a small park said she heard something like a startled cry, but wasn't sure if it was kids or a street vendor. A boy in the neighborhood said he thought he saw a dark-colored car driving unusually slowly, but couldn't recall the plates. A man said he saw Rebecca walking faster than usual, but didn't notice anyone behind her. The statements were virtually identical to what police had heard in 1966, vague, confused, close but not specific enough to point anywhere. And most importantly, the stretch where Rebecca vanished also had a blind spot, exactly like the three in Janet's case. It was a narrow section between two rows of houses with high fences, where tree shadows blocked the view from both sides. Rebecca was last seen stepping into that stretch, and then no one saw her again. When local police arrived at the scene, they repeated almost word for word the 1966 reports: no physical signs, no items remaining, no clear evidence of violence. Some of the older officers who had heard of the Janet Harlan case whispered among themselves that the situation felt eerily familiar, but at that time investigative procedure and thinking still had no concept of repeating criminal patterns. Houston police treated each disappearance as an isolated incident unless there was ironclad proof linking them, and in Rebecca Sloan's case, there was no such proof. No purple ribbon, no trampled path, no abandoned house, no witness certain Rebecca had been approached. Even the dark car mentioned didn't match any description from Janet's case. So inside the department, one sentence was repeated often: there's no basis to connect the two incidents. Janet's case by then had already been filed as a serious missing person, with no active investigation. The team handling Rebecca was a different, younger, less experienced group, and none of them pulled the 1966 file to compare similarities. And so, within hours, a crucial opportunity to link the two cases, an opportunity that could have brought justice closer, was missed. Most strikingly, the time Rebecca was unseen was also under 10 minutes, just like Janet, and the stretch where she vanished was also inside a residential neighborhood, among closely packed houses, the place everyone assumes is safest. When Rebecca's family organized searches, residents scoured narrow paths, parks, backyards, but it was all useless. Rebecca Sloan seemed to melt into thin air. 6 weeks later, Rebecca's case hit the same dead end: no body, no physical evidence, no suspects, no leads. And once again, Houston PD closed the file and placed it in the unexplained disappearances cabinet, just as they had done with Janet. Two disappearances only 1.2 miles apart, both in the afternoon, both in crowded neighborhoods, both vanishing on short unseen stretches, yet no one connected them. To 1971 police, they were just two separate tragedies. Over time they became two pieces of a chilling pattern, a pattern that would take nearly 50 more years, when Janet's file was finally reopened, for anyone to recognize the spine-chilling similarities. But at that moment, everything sank back into silence, and Rebecca Sloane's file quickly joined the list of Houston's unsolved disappearances, lengthening the shadow that had already hung over the Heights since 1966. From 1972 onward, Janet Harlan's disappearance gradually sank beneath layers of time and paperwork. No new leads, no additional statements, no event that tied back to what happened on that sweltering 1966 afternoon. When the file was moved from active investigation to long-term storage, everything began to depend on how carefully the paperwork was preserved, and it was here, quietly, that mistakes occurred that would stretch the consequences across decades. Houston PD in that era had no digitized classification system or standardized long-term evidence storage protocols like later years. Every case, every piece of evidence, every statement depended on the diligence of the person filing and the person storing. One small mix-up, a sealed bag placed in the wrong drawer, a report slipped into the wrong box, and that information practically vanished from every future investigator's reach. And indeed, two mistakes that happened between 1972 and 1975 kept the Janet investigation off course for more than 40 years. A small piece of evidence vanished from the Janet case due to an administrative mix-up. Among the items collected from the area where Janet was last seen was a thin silver metal fragment. It didn't look like part of a bicycle, but had fresh scratches. At the time, police didn't consider it important because they couldn't confirm it belonged to Janet, yet it was still collected and sealed under basic procedure. But in 1972, while the records team was cleaning out storage, this evidence bag got mixed into a large box of 1967 traffic accident files. No one knows exactly why the bag might have been placed on the wrong cart, the label might have peeled off, or the archivist misread the abbreviated code on the bag. From that moment on, the evidence that belonged to Janet's case simply disappeared from Janet's case. More than 10 years later, an investigator happened to spot the metal fragment while reviewing old accident files. He noted that it didn't match any of the crashes, but since its origin was unknown, it was moved to yet another box labeled unidentified. Had the fragment been handled correctly in the 1970s or 1980s, the truth might have surfaced much sooner. The metal piece came from an old pickup truck accessory, owned by a potential suspect. But no one tested it, no one knew it mattered, and so it sat in the dark for over 4 decades. The crucial suspicious vehicle report, another key piece, was filed in the wrong case. During the same period, a report written by Officer Whitaker about the statement describing a dark-colored vehicle driving unusually slowly. A statement that had been downplayed at the time was bundled together with documents from child harassment cases in a different part of town. The report noted that the vehicle seen around the time Rebecca Sloane disappeared looked very similar to the vague description given by a witness in Janet's case. An older pickup, dark color, driving slowly, stopping near a blind spot on the road. The two reports could have complemented each other and possibly pointed to a single suspect. But instead of being attached to either Janet's or Rebecca's file, the report was mistakenly placed in a box labeled Suspicious Vehicles, West Side 1970, 1974, which contained dozens of unrelated minor reports. When later investigators searched Janet's file, they found no mention of any suspicious vehicle. When they checked Rebecca's file, the report wasn't there either. It existed, but it was sitting where no one thought to look. Only decades later, when the cold case unit was finally created, did an archivist stumble across the report while digitizing old records and realize it had never belonged on the West Side. By then, the potential suspect had long since died. Consequence, the case was frozen in informational darkness. From 1972 to 1985, Janet Harlan's file was pulled out and put away multiple times, each time only to add the line, "No progress." Most officers who joined in the 1980s had never even heard the name Janet Harlan. Those who had worked the original investigation had retired or transferred. Memory of the case faded, and every time the file was reviewed, it was just a stack of old papers, a map with 3 blind spots circled in red, a handful of vague statements, a purple ribbon fragment, a list of suspects no longer being followed, and a simple conclusion: no new evidence. No one knew that the two most important items, the metal fragment and the vehicle report, were sitting uselessly in unrelated storage boxes, only a few yards apart in the warehouse, but decades apart in investigative logic. If those two items had been in the right place, investigators might have seen the repeating pattern: blind spots, a suspicious pickup, disappearance within minutes, a 1.2-mile radius, afternoon timing, and especially the silent execution, hallmarks of an abductor who struck extremely fast and knew the area intimately. But the truth lay silent inside dusty file boxes. By 1985, the case was completely cold. No investigator was still actively following it. No new witnesses, no further analysis of evidence, no link to the Rebecca case. Only one line remained in HPD's internal system: Janet Harland case, unsolved, inactive. The 1980s marked the longest silence in the Janet saga, a silence caused not by a lack of clues, but because the clues themselves had been buried inside the police department's own file cabinets. The investigation wasn't just cold, it was locked away by simple human clerical error. It would take more than 30 additional years before a young investigator reopened the file, and everything finally began to move again. But in 1985, no one knew the case's turning point was already sitting in storage, just waiting to be seen. From the late 1980s, almost to the start of the 21st century, Janet Harland's disappearance fell into what investigators call total freeze, a prolonged silence, not because the case was unimportant, but because it had no foothold left to move forward. Every lid ended in a dead end. Every line of inquiry circled back to the beginning. The case existed like a motionless shadow amid the fast-moving current of Houston's time. The 1980s ended, then the 1990s. The city changed, the population changed. Vacant lots were replaced with new homes. The stretches once considered blind spots were widened or repaved. The children who had once heard their parents talk about Janet grew up, went away to college, got jobs, started families, and with each generation that passed, the case sank deeper into the city's memory. In the Houston PD records room, the file labeled Harland, Janet, missing 1966, sat inside an old cardboard box with a sticker on top that read inactive, no leads. The documents inside were worn by time, corners torn, ink smudged, ballpoint notes half faded. The original photo of Janet, smiling in a striped shirt, was yellowed, its edges curled. Worse still, fragile evidence like the purple ribbon and the hand-drawn map of the blind spots sat in cracked, no longer airtight evidence bags. Some of the frantic margin notes written in the first week were nearly illegible. The investigators who had worked the case in 1966 gradually left the force. Some retired, some transferred, some passed away. Every time the detective squad changed personnel, Janet's case was pushed further down the list of cold cases, unlikely to be reactivated, because there was no physical evidence left to test with newer techniques. No one still remembered every original detail. No one still alive could describe the scene exactly as it had been. No one could still feel the oddness of the neighborhood layout from that year. Somehow, the case wasn't just frozen, it had been severed from its own context. Houston gradually forgot the story of the girl who rode her bike away from home and vanished. In the 1990s, Houston exploded in population, highways were widened, new subdivisions sprang up. Houston Heights, the once cozy little neighborhood, began to change its face. Old modest houses were torn down for new builds. Weathered wooden fences were replaced with concrete walls. The ancient trees that once hid the blind spots were trimmed back or toppled by storms. The people who lived there when Janet disappeared were now elderly. Many had moved away. As the old neighbors left, they took the memory of the case with them, and a new neighborhood formed that never knew the story that once haunted the place. By the mid-2000s, if you asked a young Heights resident whether they had ever heard of Janet Harland, most would shake their head. To them, it was just a name on the city's long list of decades-old missing persons cases, a list so long that everyone had grown used to unsolved mysteries. A case locked tight by time itself, many times over 3 decades, Houston PD went through the routine of reviewing old files, and every time Janet's case was pulled out, then closed again after just a few hours. The reason was always the same: no new physical evidence testable with DNA, no confirmed final route taken by Janet, none of the original suspects still alive, no statement strong enough to justify reopening an active investigation. The 1989 entry read, "System book case reviewed, insufficient evidence for further action. System book case status unchanged. System book case status unchanged. System book case status unchanged. No progress." The Japanese characters showed the reviewer had just returned from an international exchange program, but the message was identical to notes written 20 years earlier. Layer after layer of time sealed the case like sheets of glue. With every passing year the chance of solving it shrank a little more, until even the investigators believed Janet Harland would never have an answer. The name Janet Harland disappeared from the city's conversation. The oldest residents who had witnessed the case gradually passed away. Some had written their feelings in diaries, but their families never knew those pages were tied to a disappearance. Others moved away and never spoke of it again. At community meetings, no one mentioned Janet anymore. In the local newspaper archives, only a few yellowed articles remained, never reprinted. Little by little, the story of the 14-year-old girl who rode away on a sweltering afternoon and vanished as if she had never existed, became a mystery that lived only in fading case files, and in the memories of the few officers who had once read them, and closed them again in disappointment. By 2010, the Janet Harland case was officially coded cold case, level 3 extremely low activity, meaning it would only be re-examined if an extraordinary discovery or new lead arrived. But Houston sent no new leads. The case sank completely into oblivion. Only when a young investigator joined the cold case unit in 2019, the one who would finally see what no one had seen for more than half a century, did the Janet Harland case breathe again for the first time. But from 1985 to 2019, it was 33 years of silence, dust and torn faded pages, 3 full decades of total freeze for a case that once made an entire neighborhood tremble. In 2019, the Houston Police Department created a new unit, the Cold Case Unit, dedicated to re-examining cases abandoned for decades, especially unsolved disappearances. Among the hundreds of old files transferred to the new office was one thin folder, held together by a brittle rubber band, its cover torn, the pages inside yellowed. Harland, Janet, missing 1966. To most veteran investigators, it was simply an unsalvageable file, but to Maria Bledsoe, the unit's youngest detective at 29, the case grabbed her attention from the very first moment. Bledsoe had grown up in the Houston Heights area herself, though she had never heard of Janet. As she read the opening lines of the file, something felt wrong, not with the crime, but with the way the 1966 investigation had been documented. Maria Bledsoe had an advantage many seasoned investigators lacked. She carried no old assumptions. It didn't matter what anyone had once thought or concluded. She approached the case as if it had happened yesterday. Bledsoe reread every statement and saw the glaring inconsistency. In her first week, she spent hours poring over every witness statement, every report, every scribbled note, and she immediately spotted something the 1966 investigators had either missed or never thought worth noticing. The statements about Janet's final direction of travel did not simply disagree, they contradicted each other in ways that could not coexist. One witness said Janet turned east. Another witness was certain Janet never went east. One said she headed toward the park. Another said she went straight. But what stood out most was not the contradiction itself, it was one statement that had been recorded with the wrong time. Not a smudged word or letter, but the wrong hour. A timing error that had thrown the entire investigative theory off course for 53 years. The statement recorded at the wrong time, and its shocking consequence, it was Mrs. Harrington's statement, the neighbor who insisted Janet never passed her house that afternoon. In the original file, the handwritten note claimed she had looked out into her yard, around 4:20 p.m., exactly the window when Janet was believed to be passing that stretch. Because of that, 1966 investigators wrote, "Possible Janet did not take this route." But Bledsoe noticed something odd when examining the original handwritten record. The 420 had a digit written over another, almost impossible to read clearly. She located a different scan, enlarged it, and realized the original time was not 4:20, but 4:50. A seemingly tiny difference, 30 minutes, but it changed the entire logic of the case. If Mrs. Harrington only looked outside at 4:50, her statement did not rule out Janet passing her house earlier, between 4:15 and 4:20, the last time she was seen. In other words, the statement that had caused police to eliminate a major route was in fact incapable of eliminating anything at all. The moment she realized this, Bledsoe felt as if an entire wall in the old case had cracked open. So many assumptions had been built on this single error. So much of 1966's effort had been spent searching in the wrong direction because of one overwritten digit. Bledsoe confirmed it with modern methods. Bledsoe tracked down Mrs. Harrington's original witness envelope, miraculously, still in storage. Inside was another handwritten note marked unused at the time. On that sheet, the time was written clearly, looked out at 4:50 p.m., that was the second piece of proof of the mistake. She went further, cross-checking 1966 Houston weather records and Mrs. Harrington's daily routine as documented in the witness file. Everything showed the woman usually watered her plants right before dinner, between 4:45 and 5 o'clock, not at 4:20. There was no longer any doubt. The 1966 statement had been recorded with the wrong time, and that single error had derailed the entire original investigation. Consequence: a correct investigative path was blocked for over half a century. If the statement had been recorded correctly in 1966, police could have continued analyzing Janet's main route instead of discarding it, expanded the search in the exact blind spot area, returned to the vacant lot multiple times, re-interviewed other witnesses whose information lined up. Instead, they believed that route had been ruled out and shifted every resource elsewhere. Bledsoe reimagined Janet's final direction, redrew the map, and recalculated travel time for a 14-year-old on a bicycle. When she put everything together with the correct timing, the pieces suddenly fit perfectly. Janet had plenty of time to pass Mrs. Harrington's house between 4:15 and 4:20 p.m. Mrs. Harrington didn't see her, because she only stepped outside at 4:50. This reopened the possibility that Janet had taken the very route everyone had believed. For 53 years she never did. Bledsoe submitted her report, and the case was reactivated. When Maria Bledsoe wrote up her full findings, the report was over 12 pages long, packed with diagrams, timeline comparisons, and scans of the original statements. The cold case unit commander read it, and said only one thing: "We just found the case's lost starting point." Janet's file was moved from level 3, extremely low activity, to active review. That meant a dedicated investigator was assigned. The case was authorized to use modern forensic resources. All old evidence would be located and re-examined. Any surviving witnesses would be re-interviewed. And most importantly, Janet Harlan's final direction, the one thought locked away since 1966, was now opened for the first time in over half a century. For Bledsoe, it wasn't just a procedural breakthrough. It was the moment she felt, unmistakably, this case can still reach the truth. And from that point on, the disappearance that seemed forever frozen began to move again. In 2019, after discovering the misrecorded statement that had thrown the entire 1966 investigation off course, Maria Bledsoe decided to take the next step, track down every original piece of evidence in the Janet Harlan case. It was no easy task. Most items had been sealed in paper bags and stored in a damp warehouse for over 5 decades. Many bags were rotted, labels faded, some no longer legible. But if she wanted to know what really happened, Bledsoe had to dig up what time had tried so hard to bury. The journey to recover evidence thought lost forever. The most important item in Janet's file was the purple ribbon fragment found wedged between fence slats beside one of the 1966 blind spots. When Bledsoe went to storage to retrieve it, she discovered the evidence bag had been misplaced, sitting in a box labeled Lost and Found, 1970, 1978. It was a familiar mistake from the old days. An archivist only had to misread a faded label, and the item landed in the wrong box. No one did it on purpose, but that tiny error had kept a critical clue missing for over 40 years. The bag holding the ribbon was yellowed, and so brittle it could tear with the slightest bend. But the ribbon inside, though faded, remained intact. What stopped Bledsoe in her tracks was the edge of the ribbon. It showed an irregular tear, as if it had been yanked hard rather than cut with scissors. That matched the theory that Janet had been grabbed or pulled back in the blind spot area in 1966. She immediately requested the item be transferred to HPD's Modern Crime Lab for processing with current microparticle and DNA analysis, technologies that simply did not exist in 1966. Modern technology unlocked the evidence secrets. In the state-of-the-art lab, technicians ran a multi-stage process, a microfiber friction analysis. This revealed the direction the ribbon was torn, the force used, and whether any object had contacted the fabric at the moment of tearing. Results: the edge was torn sharply upward with significant force, fibers split in a way consistent with being caught and yanked against a hard surface like wood or metal. This perfectly fit the scenario of the ribbon tearing, as Janet or someone moved close along the wooden fence. Trace soil analysis on the remaining dirt particles. Soil composition in Houston Heights varies block by block. Each area has a different mineral profile. If the dirt on the ribbon matched a specific location, it could pinpoint exactly where Janet had been. Comparison results: 87% match with soil from the eastern side of the neighborhood, 96% match with samples from blind spot #1, the exact spot where the ribbon was found. That meant the ribbon almost certainly came off while Janet was passing through that blind spot. Touch DNA analysis. The ribbon had been tied in Janet's hair when she left home. If any skin cells, sweat or hair oil remained, modern technology could identify the owner. Although a full nuclear DNA profile was not recoverable, the lab obtained a mitochondrial DNA profile, the type passed down through the maternal line. When compared to samples from living Harland relatives, the result showed 0.00038% chance of error. The ribbon belonged to Janet. No more doubt. No more possibly. No more vague. The purple ribbon fragment was not just a random dropped item, it was proof Janet had actually passed through, and was very likely intercepted at blind spot #1. Bledsoe stood motionless in front of the report. In that moment, an item dismissed in 1966 became the golden clue of 2019. The mysterious metal fragment was recovered too, and finally made sense. After the ribbon, Bledsoe tracked down the metal piece that had been misplaced into 1967 traffic accident files. She located the bag in a box labeled Unknown Source Materials. The fragment was about 2.3 centimeters long, thin, lightweight, with a slight curve at one corner. In 1966, police ignored it because they couldn't tell what it was. New analysis revealed the metal was steel molybdenum alloy, a material commonly used in door latch components on 1958, 1968 pickup trucks. The piece showed downward scratching, consistent with slipping off a hinge. This opened the possibility Janet had come into contact with a specific type of vehicle, an older truck or pickup. Notably, a witness in the 1971 Rebecca Sloan case also described a dark-colored pickup driving slowly near her disappearance scene. Two cases 5 years apart finally had their first point of contact. Evidence confirmed Janet's turn and overturned 53 years of wrong assumptions. When everything was put together, the ribbon torn exactly at blind spot #1 DNA proving the ribbon was Janet's, the metal fragment from a pickup truck door, the misrecorded statement that caused 1966 police to discard this route. Bledsoe reached a game-changing conclusion. Janet had gone east, along the very route police had ruled out from the beginning. This reversed the entire sketch of Janet's movements before she vanished. Wrong route = wrong investigation. Wrong investigation = missing the place Janet actually passed through. Missing that place equal sign the abductor had been protected by the investigation's own mistake. A completely new investigative path opened. Bledsoe circled the area where the ribbon fell, blind spot #1. In 1966, that corner connected to 1, an empty house 2, a vacant lot 3, a narrow alley leading to a back road, where a truck could park unnoticed. If Janet really entered the blind spot, and was stopped there, the chances were high that the abductor used a vehicle to take her away. And most crucially, this area was exactly 1.2 miles from where Rebecca Sloan disappeared, connected by back roads that fit the pattern of someone intimately familiar with the terrain. Additionally, when analyzing 1966 Houston maps, Bledsoe discovered the alley from blind spot #1 led to Fairhill Road, where a small truck repair garage operated from 1955 to 1973. Next to the garage was a row of old weekly rate motels that required no ID. All of this opened an entirely new investigative direction that no one in 1966 had ever seen. A conclusion that changed the case forever. When Bledsoe presented everything to the cold case unit, the meeting room fell silent. Not the silence of surprise, but the silence of truth finally emerging after 53 years. An older investigator blurted out, "We've been standing in the wrong place for half a century." The purple ribbon, the item most overlooked, had become the most critical key. It didn't just confirm which way Janet turned. It didn't just prove she passed through the blind spot. It didn't just reopen the possibility she was stopped by a vehicle. It opened the door to the person who had carried out at least 2 linked disappearances in Houston Heights. And from that point on, the investigation shifted from how Janet disappeared to the bigger, darker question: who had been stalking the neighborhood for years, and why had no one ever seen him? The cold case unit meeting room still carried the tense atmosphere from the earlier evidence presentation. When Maria Bledsoe moved on to the next line of inquiry, the witness statements. The physical evidence had put Janet back on the correct route, but what had caused the 1966 investigation to veer so far off course that it ignored the most critical stretch? It couldn't be just one miswritten digit. There had to be something else, an invisible influence, a deviation that was not random. Bledsoe went back to every statement, not as isolated notes, but as pieces of an overall picture. She used statement analysis software, tools unimaginable in 1966, to cross-reference times, locations, and even the tone of each witness as recorded or described in the reports. First discovery: one witness, speaking unnaturally fast on the surviving tape. In the file was an old reel-to-reel tape containing the statement of Witness A, the man who had insisted he saw Janet turn east. The tape was restored with modern technology, removing noise and clarifying the voice. What caught Bledsoe's attention: the Witness C's speech rhythm was abnormally fast. The intonation sounded unnatural. Sentences were repeatedly cut off, not the hesitation of someone trying to recall, but like someone trying to stick to a prepared script. She fed the recording into voice analysis software. The results showed markers commonly seen when a person has been coached or is trying to follow prompting: shallow breathing, flat intonation, lack of emotional variation, consistently higher than average speech speed. Not conclusive proof, but a red flag. The man might not have been speaking entirely from genuine memory. Cross-checking the statements against a 1966 neighborhood time map, Bledsoe rebuilt a 1966 Houston Heights map and created a geographic timeline. The exact moment each witness said they looked out, when they heard noises, the distance from their position to Janet's route. When she plotted Witness A's statement on the map, she found an impossibility. From where he claimed to be standing, he could not possibly have seen the stretch of road where he said Janet turned. A large house completely blocked the line of sight from his corner to the intersection. That house was demolished in 1984, but 1966 maps, supplemented by city archive photos, showed the view was totally obstructed. This raised a critical question: how could he describe Janet's turn in detail if he never saw it? From there, Bledsoe began to suspect either he was mistaken or his statement had been shaped. Witness B, the one who said "I didn't see Janet," also showed irregularities. Witness B was Mrs. Harrington, whose timing was originally thought to be 4:20, but was actually 4:50. The initial recording error had caused her statement to be misinterpreted, but when Bledsoe dug deeper, she noticed something else. Mrs. Harrington used phrases almost identical to Witness A, even though the two did not know each other and were interviewed nearly 2 hours apart. Both said nearly the same sentences. "I'm certain I would have seen her if she passed. She couldn't have gone by without me noticing." That was unusual. Two people at different locations with different sightlines. When Bledsoe checked the files, she discovered that both witnesses had been interviewed and written up by the exact same officer that day. That officer was now deceased, but he had a reputation back then for wanting reports finished fast and sometimes guiding witnesses to answers that fit the initial theory, a habit not uncommon in that era. Not malicious, just substandard procedure. Suspicion of statement manipulation emerged. When Bledsoe placed the two statements side by side, she saw Witness A was overly certain about something he could not have seen. Witness B had been led to reinforce the same conclusion. Together, the two statements created a narrative that convinced 1966 police Janet did not take the eastern route, but new evidence and analysis proved she did take that route. So how did two witnesses unintentionally reinforce a wrong conclusion? Three possibilities were raised. 1. They were unintentionally influenced by the interviewing officer. The 1966 officer may have asked leading questions like, "Are you sure Janet went the other way?" instead of, "What did you see?" A leading question can cause a witness to adjust memory to match the interviewer's expectation. 2. They were influenced by each other. Neighborhood gossip spread fast. If Witness A shared his hazy recollection, Witness B might have heard it through neighbors before being questioned. 3. Someone deliberately reinforced the wrong direction. There was no evidence the abductor manipulated witnesses, but Bledsoe did not rule out someone trying to hide something, or a resident wanting to shift suspicion away from themselves, or someone they knew. However, there were no data yet to confirm this. Tone analysis. In the 1966 officer's handwritten notes, Bledsoe spotted something odd in how the officer took notes. Witness A definitely saw Janet turn right. Witness B, impossible for Janet to have passed here. The words "definitely saw" and "impossible" were written in all caps, extremely rare in routine police notes of that period. It was the way an investigator emphasized a conclusion, not the way objective information was recorded. Possibly under pressure to solve the case quickly, the officer had unconsciously shaped the statements to fit the early assumption that Janet had turned west, causing the eastern route to be eliminated from the start. But that emphasis had locked the investigation onto the wrong path for more than half a century. Bledsoe's critical conclusion. After 900 lines of analysis, she concluded, one or more 1966 witness statements were influenced by substandard interviewing techniques. This caused a wrong investigative theory to be treated as absolute truth for 53 years. In other words, it wasn't that the witnesses were wrong, it wasn't that they lied, they had been guided, accidentally or deliberately, to remember incorrectly. The moment this truth emerged, the Janet Harland case was no longer just a mystery. It became a tragedy of flawed investigation, where one overwritten digit and a few leading questions had buried the truth for half a century. Now, with physical evidence confirming Janet's route and the statements finally decoded for what they really were, Bledsoe knew one thing for certain: Janet wasn't simply intercepted. Janet was intercepted on the exact stretch police had never examined closely enough. And that meant the abductor had to be someone who knew the neighborhood layout intimately, and knew the police would focus on the wrong place. From here, the case entered a new phase, hunting the person who had hidden behind that very misdirection. Bledsoe understood that to break the silence of more than half a century, she had to turn to the only data source still able to speak about the afternoon of July 3, 1966. The old pickup trucks that once drove around Studewood. If the 1966 metal fragment really came from a door hinge, and if the abductor had approached Janet at blind spot #1, that truck was the vehicle that made her vanish in seconds. She combed through traffic records, dug up crumbling, ink-faded, torn vehicle registration ledgers, and finally compiled a list of 12 owners of 1958, 1966 pickups living within a 1-mile radius of Janet's route. By cross-referencing work schedules, gas receipts, tax records, departure dates from the city, and scattered notes, she eliminated those with solid alibis, trucks in the shop, or who had moved away before Janet disappeared. The list shrank to 4 names, and among them, one stood out like a shadow that had lingered for over 50 years, Elliot Grayson. What was strange was not that he owned a 1959 Chevrolet Apache that matched the alloy of the evidence fragment, nor that he lived roughly 620 feet from the blind spot where Janet's ribbon fell. What was most unsettling was that he was virtually absent from the original investigation file. No statement, no interview note. Not a single line confirming he had or had not been questioned. While every other truck owner had at least a brief mention, Grayson's section was completely blank, an inexplicable void, especially since he lived right in the heart of the search area. Bledsoe dug deeper into Grayson's movements in 1966 and discovered he had only lived in the Heights from May to August, the exact months Janet disappeared, then left Houston immediately afterward, with no forwarding address. A 3-month transient resident in a neighborhood where people lived their whole lives, this was completely out of place for 1960s Houston. The deeper she went, the more suspicious coincidences piled up. The route Janet's evidence, now confirmed, matched the fastest approach Grayson could have taken. Blind spot #1 was in easy walking distance from the house he rented, and most crucially, the back alley leading to Fairhill Road, where Grayson had worked at a small garage, was the most discreet escape route to get Janet out unseen. When combined with the 1971 Rebecca Sloan case, 1.2 miles away, which also had a witness describing a slow-moving dark pickup, the name Grayson suddenly became the center of a repeating pattern: young victims, afternoon timing, residential blind spots, older truck disappearance in minutes. While sifting through a misfiled box in storage, Bledsoe found a faded 1966 officer's note. E.G. says he wasn't home at 4 p.m. Unsure. Follow up next week. The initials E.G. matched Elliot Grayson, but there was no record the follow-up ever happened. This made her realize that the chaos of the first week, combined with the focus on the wrong suspect, had let Grayson slip through the cracks. Now, with Janet's route confirmed by DNA and evidence, and the old statements revealed as guided or misrecorded, Grayson was no longer one of many truck owners. He was the strongest suspect, the only person with the location, vehicle, timing, and behavior to carry out a lightning-fast abduction. Bledsoe concluded in her internal report, if Janet was intercepted by a vehicle, Elliot Grayson is the individual most likely to have approached her in that time frame. With that finding, the investigation entered a new stage, reopening the full history, movements, relationships, property, and any remaining traces of the man who vanished from Houston, the moment Janet Harland was erased from the world unseen. Once Elliot Grayson became the prime suspect, Maria Bledsoe knew the next step could not wait. Searching Grayson's old garage, where he had worked in the late 1950s and early 60s, the building, a small shop on Fairhill Road, had closed in the 1980s, been sold to a private company, then abandoned for nearly 20 years, but property tax records showed the main structure was still standing, never demolished. If Grayson had ever hidden anything there, it was highly likely it remained inside those old walls. Entering the abandoned garage after half a century, the garage sat wedged between two newer buildings, its facade covered in peeling paint and thick dust, the roll-up door rusted stiff. Bledsoe and 2 forensic technicians had to use specialized tools to force it open. The metal groaned, as if protesting being woken after more than 50 years of silence. Inside, it was dark, the air heavy with the smell of old oil, metal and rotting wood, the scent of the era Grayson had lived in. Flashlight beams cut through the dust, revealing rusted chassis frames, empty toolboxes, and warped wooden shelves. But what caught Bledsoe's eye were not the large items, but the small, unusual ones, things an ordinary person would ignore. yet a cold case investigator could never overlook. A button small but hugely significant, in a corner near where an air compressor once stood, a technician found a small cream-colored button wedged between two floorboards, a classic style, synthetic plastic, common on children's clothing in the 1960s. Bledsoe instantly recalled Janet's clothing description from the 1966 file: light-colored cotton blouse, small buttons, 4-hole type. The button they found matched the size, matched the material of that era, was the exact type used on teenage girls' shirts. It could not be confirmed as Janet's, but it fit the description too perfectly to be dismissed as coincidence. An old map, folded many times, edges torn near the garage window, inside a rusted tin box. Technicians discovered a 1964 paper map of Houston, folded into quarters. The edges were worn as if handled repeatedly. What stood out even more were the pencil marks on it. There was a faint circle around the Houston Heights area, and when unfolded, a distinct mark right on the stretch where Janet disappeared. Bledsoe felt her chest tighten. A map highlighting the only location tied to a famous local case, found inside the prime suspect's garage, could not possibly be random. Additionally, the map showed a faint penciled line connecting Blind Spot #1 to Fair Hill Road, the exact escape route Bledsoe had already identified as the most likely way to remove Janet unseen. A map marked locations, an escape route, 3 layers overlapping like traces of a plan that once existed. A strange item, a small piece of fabric with purple stitching, in the same tin box as the map. Technicians found a tiny scrap of fabric, no larger than a postage stamp, but pale purple, very similar to the shade of the 1966 ribbon fragment. When held under light, the stitching along the edge showed violet thread, the kind commonly used as decorative trim on teenage girls' clothing back then. No one dared jump to conclusions, but everything seemed to be pulling the pieces together: a torn ribbon near the blind spot, a purple fabric scrap in the suspect's garage, a button from the same era, and a map marking the exact spot where Janet vanished. Events that once seemed disconnected were now forming a chain. Searching the small loft, what they found made Bledsoe shudder. The garage had a narrow loft, the kind used for miscellaneous storage. Up there they found mostly junk, old newspapers, nail cans, rotted cardboard boxes. But beneath the dust, Bledsoe discovered a small unlocked wooden box. Inside were 2 magazine clippings of women, a thin notebook with no owner's name, and a sheet of paper torn in half. It was the torn paper that drew every flashlight. On the remaining half, written in pencil, 0307, 4 o'clock, 6 o'clock, Heights. That was the exact date Janet disappeared. No one knew why that time window was written down, or what the missing half contained. But that simple line, "in the garage of a man who once lived near the scene," went far beyond coincidence. The garage didn't just hold old junk, it held buried history. Bledsoe stood in the middle of the garage, looking at the button, the map, the purple fabric, the paper with 3 sevens. She knew that while each item alone wasn't conclusive, together they formed a logical structure: a map marking the crime location, an item of clothing matching the victim's description, a fabric scrap, possibly from the same outfit, a note with the exact date Janet vanished, a suspect who lived nearby, owned a matching truck, and disappeared months later. In 1966, police had never looked at this garage, never searched it, never seized anything, never suspected Grayson enough to check his property. But now, for the first time in 53 years, the garage had become the first physical location containing tangible traces linked to Janet Harland. 50 years of dust couldn't erase the truth. Bledsoe sealed every item in new evidence bags, documenting position, time, and collection conditions, everything recorded clearly, accurately, to modern standards. As she stepped out of the garage, Houston's sunlight fell on the cracked concrete. A light breeze lifted dust from the old tin roof, as if the place were finally letting go of the secret it had kept for half a century. Grayson's garage wasn't just where he fixed trucks, it was where he stored the scattered fragments of a story that had never been told. And Bledsoe knew what remained in that garage was only the beginning. The next step would lead straight to the true nature of Elliot Grayson, and what he did on that summer afternoon in 1966. Bledsoe left the Fair Hill garage with one clear feeling: it was time to reconstruct Elliot Grayson's entire movements on the day Janet Harland vanished. If Grayson really was the person who intercepted Janet at blind spot #1, he had to have been in the area from mid-afternoon until around 5 p.m., the window where every statement was vague, and Janet disappeared in a matter of unnoticed minutes. But to prove it, Bledsoe needed to re-examine everything Grayson did that day: receipts, documents, work logs, witnesses, even the stray bits of information overlooked in 1966. Those records were scattered across civil archives, traffic offices, tax files, and many had rotted with time. Yet the deeper she dug, the stranger it became. Everything about that afternoon contradicted itself. The gas receipt, once treated as alibi confirmation, the 1966 file noted that Grayson had filled up at the Blue Star station around 4 p.m. This was used to suggest he wasn't on Stoodwood when Janet was taken. But when Bledsoe located the original receipt, the handwriting was so faded, it was nearly illegible. She ran it through character recovery software, enlarging every ink stroke, and discovered the 4 could very well have been a 1. The receipt might actually say 1:17 p.m., not 4 p.m. This collapsed the entire alibi argument. If Grayson filled up at 1 p.m., he could easily have been in the Stoodwood area all afternoon. If he filled up at 4 p.m., he almost certainly could not have been at the blind spot on time. A timing discrepancy that once caused police to dismiss Grayson now undermined the very evidence that had kept him clean. Work documents, a schedule too perfect to be real. In 1966, Grayson worked freelance, fixing cars on call with no fixed schedule. Yet the old case file contained a note: Grayson says he was repairing Mr. Harvey's car 3:30 p.m., 5 p.m. This had once been treated as a strong alibi. If he was working for a customer, he couldn't have been at the blind spot. But when Bledsoe tracked down Harvey's descendants to verify, no one remembered Grayson ever working for the family. No repair invoice in their financial records, no record of any repair that day. Even more suspicious, there was no customer signature or receipt, only a sheet written by Grayson himself, and the handwriting matched exactly the notebook found in the garage. This alibi had never been reliable. It was a one-sided claim. Neighbors provide new statements, old memories that cannot be ignored. Bledsoe located elderly residents who had lived near Grayson in 1966. Most remembered little, but one man, Mr. Claiborne, upon seeing a photo of Grayson's old house, said, "I remember him coming home that afternoon. The truck door slammed hard, really loud." When asked the time, he replied, "After 4 o'clock, the sun was still up but softer than the 3 o'clock heat." That statement made the entire team look at each other. Because if Grayson got home after 4 p.m., he was in the Stoodwood area exactly when Janet vanished. Claiborne had never been interviewed in 1966. He said no one ever knocked on his door. A new witness, an old memory, but perfectly matching Janet's disappearance window. Vehicle registration history: the 1959 Apache vanished after August 1966. When Bledsoe checked Grayson's vehicle records, she discovered his 1959 Chevrolet Apache disappeared from the system in September 1966. Not sold, not transferred, not reported scrapped, not reported wrecked. It simply ceased to exist. At the same time, Grayson left Houston. A pickup truck, potentially the abduction vehicle, vanished with its owner right after the crime. To a cold case investigator, that is not just suspicious, it is the pattern of someone erasing traces. Modern route reconstruction, revealing an alarming gap. For the first time, Bledsoe used current technology to reconstruct Grayson's possible movements on July 3, 1966. From the gas receipt, likely 1:17 p.m., his home, the garage and the blind spot, she mapped feasible routes, and felt a chill, a complete gap from 3:45 p.m. to 4:20 p.m., with no evidence placing Grayson anywhere. That gap perfectly overlapped: Janet riding her bike, Janet disappearing, Claiborne hearing the loud truck door, the time Grayson's Apache could have pulled into the alley and vanished unseen. Grayson's alibi wasn't just weak, it crumbled under timed data. Signs of file tampering, a suspicion hard to ignore. In the archives, Bledsoe found 2 report pages with torn corners, the corners that recorded receipt times. On another page was a note, e.g. schedule, follow up, but no next page existed. Some pages showed traces of different colored ink written over time entries, exactly like the error in Mrs. Harrington's statement. This led Bledsoe to suspect that in the chaos of the first week of 1966, some Grayson-related facts had been misrecorded, overwritten, or removed, not to hide guilt, but from careless procedure. Yet the effect was the same as concealment. Grayson became a shadow that slipped through the cracks. Alibi collapses. Grayson becomes suspect number 1, when Bledsoe compiled everything into a 17-page report and presented it to the cold case unit. Gas receipt, wrong time, invalid alibi, self-written repair schedule, unverifiable. New neighbor recalling truck door after 4 p.m. matches disappearance window. Truck vanishes from records after the crime, abnormal. No evidence placing Grayson outside the area, in the critical window. Every document about him, riddled with contradictions. Bledsoe's conclusion, no remaining data supports Elliot Grayson's alibi. He had full opportunity to intercept Janet on the afternoon of July 3, 1966. The meeting room went quiet for several seconds before the unit commander said, "We've found the right guy." Grayson's alibi, the very thing that kept police from suspecting him, was completely destroyed. After more than half a century, the Janet Harlan case finally had a face to look at. But to nail Grayson dead or alive, Bledsoe needed more, and the next step would take her into the most dangerous part of the case, direct evidence. Bledsoe walked into the Houston PD lab on that fateful morning, with the clear feeling that the Janet Harlan case, frozen for 53 years, was finally about to reach its breaking point. The items recovered from Grayson's garage had been sent for trace analysis weeks earlier: the button, the purple fabric scrap, the tin box, the folded map, and especially the fabric scrap found inside the tin, the one Bledsoe sensed would become the key. The forensic technicians called her in, because the official touch DNA results were ready, and the moment she stepped inside, the expressions on the analysts' faces told her they had just touched what all of Houston had been searching for over half a century. Touch DNA result: a mitochondrial profile matching the Harlan maternal line. The technician handed Bledsoe a nearly 30-page report. The touch DNA comparison from the purple fabric scrap found in Grayson's garage. Modern touch DNA technology can detect just a few skin cells or natural oils, something almost impossible in 1966. And the result was chilling. Match probability, 99.998%. Mitochondrial DNA consistent with maternal line of Janet Harlan. This meant the mitochondrial DNA recovered from the fabric came from the same maternal line as Janet. It could not be stated 100% that it was Janet's, but the probability was too high to ignore. The purple fabric in Grayson's garage was linked to someone in the Harlan family. A tiny piece of evidence, forgotten in a dark garage, had suddenly become the first direct physical proof connecting the suspect to the victim. Bledsoe felt her heart turn to lead. She knew this result was not just another clue, it was a devastating blow to any innocence scenario for Grayson. When evidence plus route plus statements plus DNA merged into one big picture, Bledsoe pulled every piece together. Janet's purple ribbon dropped near blind spot hash. 1. The purple fabric in Grayson's garage, carrying DNA consistent with the Harlan maternal line. The old map marking the exact spot where Janet vanished. The paper noting 3/7, the day of the crime. The button matching Janet's clothing description. Grayson's alibi completely collapsed. Grayson's truck vanishing right after the crime. A new neighbor witness hearing Grayson's truck door at the exact disappearance window. Grayson living only 620 feet from the scene. Taken alone, each item was not conclusive, but together, they formed a structure so tight it could not be dismissed. And most crucially, for the first time, there was physical evidence linking Janet to a space owned by Elliot Grayson. That was enough to move to the final stage, requesting an arrest warrant. Behavioral analysis, the pattern of an opportunistic predator. Before filing for the warrant, Bledsoe needed one more piece: behavioral analysis. She brought in an FBI behavioral analysis unit, BO expert, who had assisted on cold cases. After reviewing all the data, they delivered a profile showing a shocking level of fit for Grayson, a victim-type females age 12, 14 traveling alone in residential areas. Late afternoon timing with few witnesses, matched Janet. Crime scene environment, rare blind spot stretches back alley escape routes to low-traffic roads, right next to where Grayson lived. 100% match. Post-offense behavior, disappearing from the area, disposing of the involved vehicle, no long-term relationship, matched Grayson leaving Houston in August 1966. Trophy retention offenders sometimes keep small items from victims as trophies. The tin box containing fabric, map and button fit this pattern perfectly. The profile concluded, Elliot Grayson exhibits a behavioral pattern highly consistent with the perpetrator in the Janet Harlan case. Behavioral analysis does not prove guilt, but it strengthened the warrant application, especially when the warrant had to rest on a rock-solid chain of evidence, not speculation. Preparing the arrest warrant packet, the first in 53 years, Bledsoe and the Harris County Assistant District Attorney began drafting the filing. Key elements in the application: one-touch DNA matching the Harlan family, direct physical link 2, garage evidence showing an inexplicable connection 3, map marking the exact crime scene 4, new neighbor witness hearing Grayson's truck door in the disappearance window 5, Grayson's disappearance after August 1966, behavioral analysis, matching the offender profile 7, 1966 officer note, indicating Grayson needed follow-up 8, perfect alignment between Janet's confirmed route and Grayson's access path. Everything was presented in a filing over 60 pages, one of the most complete cold case warrant packets the office had ever handled. When the report was submitted to the judge, the courtroom fell dead silent. A case more than 5 decades old, no body, no living perpetrator, no confession, yet backed by a fortress of evidence, strong enough to make everyone look again. The Harris County District Court judge turned each page. Almost no one breathed. Then she set down her pen and signed decisively. The arrest warrant is officially signed, a historic moment. On September 12, 2019, at 4:28 p.m., the Harris County Court signed an official arrest warrant for Elliot James Grayson, suspected of the abduction and murder of Janet Harlan, 1966. Even if Grayson was deceased, the warrant still carried weight. It authorized full searches of any remaining property he owned. It allowed DNA samples from relatives for comparison. It permitted expanding the investigation to other potential victims, and most importantly, it legally recognized Grayson's probable guilt, based on valid evidence. Bledsoe stared at the warrant, her hand trembling slightly. In 1966, Houston police had never come close to the killer. In 2019, the truth had finally been acknowledged by a court. The warrant was not the end, it was the key to the final door of the case. In that moment, Bledsoe knew they had crossed a line. No longer suspicion, no longer intuition, no longer inference. For the first time in 53 years, the justice system recognized they had found Janet Harlan's abductor, and from here, the investigation would go straight into the most dangerous and shocking part, tracing where Grayson took Janet and what happened next. The signing of the warrant shifted the entire cold case unit into emergency mode. For months the team had tracked every trace of Elliot Grayson, and finally discovered he was still alive, 82 years old, living in a mobile home on the outskirts of Livingston, Texas, under his legal name. The news was shocking. A man thought to have vanished from the system in 1966, had been living a quiet life, completely unsuspected. When police and U.S. Marshals descended, Grayson stepped out of the trailer, thin, silver-haired, slightly stooped, but his eyes were still sharp and cold, nothing like a frail old man. He remained unnaturally calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment for years. When the officer read the warrant in connection with Janet Harlan's disappearance, Grayson just looked at them, gave a faint cryptic smile, and said, "You people are still digging up that old story." That remark was not a confession, but it was not the protest of an innocent man either. It sent a chill down Bledsoe's spine. She was present at the arrest. In the interrogation room, Grayson asked for coffee and claimed health issues, trying to project the image of a harmless elderly man. But once questioning began, the facade cracked quickly. He denied everything, saying he never met Janet and knew nothing about the 1966 disappearance. Yet the investigators only needed a few basic questions to expose contradictions. When asked what he was doing on the afternoon of July 3, 1966, Grayson replied, "I was fixing a car for a friend. No, a regular customer. Wait, I think I was at the garage." Bledsoe watched him constantly shift timelines, classic signs of someone trying to reconstruct a lie after more than 50 years, but no longer remembering what he had originally fabricated. When shown the self-written repair schedule, Grayson said, "I don't remember writing that. Maybe someone asked me to hold on to it," an absurd excuse, since the handwriting matched 100% with the notebook found in his garage. Bledsoe waited until Grayson's composure began to waver before hitting harder. "The touch DNA evidence." She placed the report in front of him, and said slowly, deliberately, "Mitochondrial DNA on the fabric from your garage is consistent with Janet Harlan's maternal line." Grayson stared at the file, narrowed his eyes, then pressed his lips together, not because he didn't understand, but because he understood all too well. Seconds later, he gave a thin smile. "DNA. New technology. You people love that stuff." That was not the reaction of an innocent man shocked by coincidence. It was the reaction of someone who knew he had been cornered. The interrogation continued, and Grayson grew visibly unsettled. When asked if he ever drove his 1959 Chevrolet Apache along Stoodwood, he denied it emphatically. "I never went down that road. No reason to." But Bledsoe produced the 1964 map, found in his garage, with the pencil mark exactly where Janet vanished. Grayson's face twitched. The first time in the session, he lost his calm. "Someone put that map in my garage," he claimed, but the excuse came too late. It was the clear sign of a man who knew the evidence could destroy him. When questioned about leaving Houston in August 1966, Grayson's answers again conflicted, first for work, then for health, then because the neighborhood was changing. Finally he snapped, "I left because I didn't want to live in a place where kids don't know how to stay safe." The moment he said it, the room went silent. Bledsoe recognized it was not a casual remark. It carried blame, as if he were faulting the victim for making herself vulnerable. In criminal psychology files, this is called justification language, the internal rationalization offenders use to lessen their own responsibility. But what riveted everyone was one slip Grayson made while pretending to be tired and trying to end the session. "I told you, I just parked there for a minute. That's all." Parked where? No one in the room had asked him about there. No one during the interrogation had mentioned a specific location. The sentence could only mean one thing. Grayson was referring to the exact spot where Janet was intercepted. He had just admitted knowledge of the crime scene, something an innocent person could not have let slip. After that, Grayson realized his mistake and clamped his mouth shut, leaned back, folded his arms, and said nothing more. But it was too late. To the investigators, that slip was stronger than any direct confession. Bledsoe wrote in her report, Grayson displayed cognitive conflict patterns, shifting statements under pressure, and demonstrated insider knowledge of the crime scene that only the perpetrator would possess. At the end of the session, when informed he would be held pending further investigation, Grayson let out one final sentence, not a defense, but something that sounded like a lament slipping from deep inside. "She shouldn't have fought back. It made everything worse." The room fell silent. No one asked anything more. No one needed to. In that moment, even though Grayson still denied everything, the entire team knew they had just heard something. Cold cases rarely get a genuine fragment of the perpetrator's soul, opening the door to the next step, finding where Janet was taken, and the final official statement that would force Grayson to face the truth he had evaded for half a century. The trial of Elliot Grayson began on a windy, cold February morning at the Harris County Courthouse. No body, no eyewitness, no confession. Yet the courtroom was packed. Reporters, former Houston Heights residents, people who had lived under the shadow of the 14-year-old girl who vanished in their neighborhood. For many, this was not just a trial, it was the last chance to put an end to a ghost that had haunted them for over half a century. And from the moment the prosecution began presenting its case, everything unfolded like a meticulous, chilling, airtight reconstruction that made everyone present feel the full weight of a truth finally being resurrected. The prosecution reconstructs the timeline. Every minute of the afternoon of July 3, 1966, brought back to light. No body was needed. The prosecution knew that in a no-body homicide, the most critical element is time, and they had a timeline so airtight it could not be broken. 4:05 p.m. Janet leaves home with a book, riding her bicycle. 4:12. 4:18 p.m. Witness A sees Janet heading east, after correcting the misrecorded statement. 4:15. 4:20 p.m. The purple ribbon tears and falls at blind spot #1. 4:18 p.m. Grayson has no alibi. The gas receipt is proven to be from 1 p.m. 4:25 p.m. The loud truck door slam heard by witness Claiborne, consistent with a 1959 Apache. 4:26 p.m. No one sees Janet again. No one sees Grayson's truck again. The gap from 3:45, 4:20 p.m. once a hole became the backbone of the trial. The prosecution proved that in that window, only one person was in the right place, at the right time, with the right vehicle: Elliot Grayson. Defense counsel tried to object, arguing, no one saw him take Janet, but the prosecutor shot back, opportunistic predators don't need witnesses, they need 10 seconds, and a blind spot. Circumstantial web, each piece tightening around Grayson. This was not one piece of evidence, it was a net that enveloped Grayson from every angle. A. Touch DNA in Grayson's garage, mitochondrial DNA, consistent with the Harland maternal line, random chance virtually zero. B. Button plus purple fabric scrap, plus marked map, impossible to explain why they were in the garage of a man who never knew the victim. C. Apache truck vanishing, after the crime. Not sold, not transferred, not reported scrapped, simply gone. D. 1964 map, with a mark at the exact spot Janet disappeared. One single X at blind spot #1. E. Paper noting 3/7, the only date written in the tin box, no other dates. F. Fabricated alibi, repair schedule written by Grayson himself, corroborated by no one. G. Behavioral analysis, perfect match to the profile of a 1960s street abduction predator. The prosecution concluded, no single piece of evidence convicts the defendant by itself, but all of them together create a truth that cannot be denied. Grayson's own statements became the knife that wounded him. The most tense moment came when the prosecution played the interrogation recording, especially the line that froze the entire courtroom. I just parked there for a minute. No one had said where there was. Grayson said it himself. Both jury and judge understood. This was not the slip of an innocent man. It was the slip of someone who knew the location intimately, who had tried to bury the memory, but let it escape. Defense counsel visibly shook. They tried to claim the statement was taken out of context, but the prosecutor asked one simple question: what context makes an innocent man park for a minute at the exact spot a little girl vanished? No one could answer. The prosecution argues, based on no-body homicide jurisprudence precedent, Houston had convicted in 3 previous no-body murder cases. The prosecution cited precedent: State v. Rodriguez, 1998, Harris County, Lindstrom 2006, Texas v. Grant, 2010. In every one, conviction stood when 1. The victim disappeared suddenly, and without reason. 2. No contact with family since the disappearance. 3. The defendant was the last person with opportunity. 4. Physical or circumstantial evidence linked the defendant, the prosecutor declared. The Janet Harland case meets all 4 criteria, and goes further. Physical evidence leads straight to the defendant's property. The jury deliberates, and grasps what truly matters. They did not need an answer to every detail. They did not need to know exactly what Grayson did every minute. They did not need a body. They only needed to know. Only one person was in the right place at the right time. Only one person had the victim's belongings in his possession. Only one person repeatedly fabricated alibis. Only one person accidentally revealed insider knowledge of the scene. And that person was Elliot Grayson. The verdict. When the jury foreperson stood, the courtroom fell so silent, it felt frozen in time. We find the defendant guilty. A collective exhale rippled through the room, not relief, but a kind of release for a community that had waited far too long for justice. The judge continued, Elliot James Grayson, you have been found guilty of causing the death of Janet Harland in 1966. Even though he was now 82, even though time had blurred every trace, Texas law declared clearly, crime has no statute of limitations, truth has no expiration date, and justice, however late, is still justice. The trial ended, but the aftershocks of this verdict would ripple through the Houston community in the final chapter of the story. The guilty verdict against Elliot Grayson didn't just close a case that had lasted over half a century, it shook the entire Houston Police Department to its core. In the courthouse hallways that day, as the public filed out and cameras were packed away, veteran officers and young detectives stood motionless, all feeling the same thing: no case ever truly dies. There are only cases people stop listening for, and the Janet Harland case became the most powerful example of why the cold case unit doesn't just exist, it has to be the beating heart of delayed justice. Houston PD leadership holds emergency meeting. What else did we miss for 53 years? The week after Grayson's conviction, Houston PD leadership held the longest meeting in cold case history. The chief opened with, if the Janet case could be solved with no body, no confession, no eyewitness, what other cases are sleeping that we could still wake up? No one answered, because everyone understood the implication, the inconsistencies of 1966, misrecorded statements, misfiled evidence, suspects never interviewed, might have happened in many others. The Grayson story became a wake-up call. New policy: every pre-1990 missing person case will be re-examined at least once. For the first time in Houston PD history, a new regulation was signed. All missing persons cases from 1950, 1990 will undergo active review at least once every 5 years. This meant no case would ever again be labeled too old. No file would be dismissed simply for lack of initial evidence. Evidence once deemed worthless would be retested with modern technology. The cold case commander addressed the entire unit. If Janet Harland could still speak after 53 years, every other victim can too. Investigators start digging through every old box and quickly find similar mistakes. In just 3 months, the cold case team uncovered 14 statements with wrong times recorded in old cases, 7 pieces of evidence filed in the wrong case jackets, 3 suspects who were never interviewed despite living near the scene, 2 cases with evidence suitable for modern DNA testing that had never been analyzed. One young officer gasped while opening a 1974 file, "My God, did we really miss this much?" It wasn't blame toward past generations, it was the realization that technology, procedure, training, and professional awareness had evolved so much that what was impossible in 1960 now took only hours to reveal. Janet's family is invited to tour the new cold case unit. A new promise begins. As a long overdue apology, Houston PD invited 2 of Janet's nieces to visit the new cold case headquarters. They were walked through the Touch DNA lab, the historical map comparison room, the digitized evidence vault, the 3D crime scene reconstruction area. One niece broke down when she saw the recreated image of Janet's final route that afternoon, the first time the family could clearly see the last minutes of the girl's life. Bledsoe stood beside her and quietly said, "Because of your Aunt Janet's story, from now on, no one in Houston will ever be forgotten." Case Review Project, screening 420 unsolved disappearances. Houston PD created a new subcommittee, the Case Review Project, dedicated to re-examining disappearances from 1950, 1980. 10 cases analyzed each week, 3 routes reconstructed each month. Every case assigned a code: green solvable, now with DNA technology. Yellow needs statement and evidence cross-check red. Very little data, but still monitored. One investigator said, "The Janet case taught us that a single tiny piece of evidence can change everything. We are never allowed to overlook any detail again." Other victims' families begin to come forward. After the Grayson verdict, the cold case hotline received hundreds of calls. "My child disappeared in 1973. Please look again. My sister vanished in 1961. It's been 58 years. Is there still a chance? We've kept a small item all this time. Could it help?" The most moving question, repeated over and over, is it too late for justice? And now the cold case unit could answer with a confidence it had never had before. No, it is never too late. Conclusion. The Janet Harlan case becomes the new standard for cold case investigation. From this point forward, every investigator is trained on 3 principles drawn from the Janet case. 1. Never accept initial statements as absolute if the timing data shows any sign of error. 2. Every piece of evidence, no matter how small, even a button can break a case. 3. No case is too old as long as one fragment of truth still exists somewhere. The Janet Harlan case did not just find its perpetrator, it changed the way Houston PD looks at the past. Bledsoe wrote in her final summary, "Janet never came home, but she saved other cases from being buried the way she once was." And that is the strongest aftershock a cold case can leave, turning one person's tragedy into a permanent reminder that justice can always be found, even if it takes a lifetime. The story of the Janet Harlan case in Houston Heights in 1966 is not just a personal tragedy. It clearly reflects issues America still faces today: the fragility of community safety, the fallibility of systems, and the question of what we truly do for victims. The fact that a 14-year-old girl could vanish in a 10-minute gap between 2 rows of houses, in a blind spot everyone assumed was a safe neighborhood, reminds Americans today that safety is not just a feeling, it is the result of vigilance, urban design, cameras, street lighting, and neighbors looking out for one another. The procedural mistakes of 1966, the scene trampled, Janet's purple ribbon dismissed, the metal fragment misfiled into a traffic accident case, suspect Elliot Grayson never properly questioned, are a reminder that systems can fail, and therefore citizens have the right, even the duty, to ask questions, demand transparency, and support investment in forensic science, investigator training, and cold case units. Conversely, half a century later, the fact that a young detective like Maria Bledsoe dared to reread every statement, spotted the miswritten time digit, tracked down the button and the map with the X, and used touch DNA to secure a conviction in a no-body homicide, shows the power of persistence and technology when applied correctly. The lesson for Americans today: never treat a small detail as meaningless, whether it's a kid riding a bike in the neighborhood, a stranger parked too long on the corner, or a tiny piece of evidence in an old case. Never believe it happened too long ago. Nothing can be done. It is precisely the attitude that no case is too old for an answer that helps American communities honor victims, heal the past, and build a culture of justice that never abandons the most vulnerable. If you believe cold case stories like Janet Harlan's deserve to keep being brought into the light, please hit subscribe to join us. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video, where we'll continue the journey to find justice for those who have been forgotten.